So, hello friends, we have covered two chapters so far, and now we are dealing with the third chapter, which is called Understanding Experience. It is part 5. So, let's start. Implication for social science theory. Why do these philosophical approaches to the self have to do with social theory? First of all, almost all essential ideas of the human, such as freedom, will, action, morality, and reason, have been associated with the self. The category of experience, as described earlier, is also related to the metaphysics of the self. In a way, the self is the common site where theory and experience meet. However, there is a lot that is unclear in such description. Primarily, there seems to be an implicit acceptance of an entity called the self, although there have been influential attempts to discredit this belief in the existence of such an entity. In the contemporary discussion, the notion of the self continued to be prominent. Almost all, any attempt to talk about ideas of freedom, identity, community, and so on invoke the notion of the self. Moreover, in contemporary time, the self has become more complex, more divisive, and more unstable. Mansfield note that contemporary global society, unlike earlier times in Western century, is one that places enormous premium on feeling. Moreover, alienation in society, the rise of various crimes associated with dysfunctional self, and instability in the growth of self, particularly in the teenage years, seems to have brought the idea of the self into prominence, although without much clarity on what is being referred to when one talk about the self. As already discussed above, the notion of the self goes along with that of the object. Mansfield point out the subject is always linked to something outside of it, and it is this character of being linked to other subject and to the world that is an essential mark of the subject. The notion of the subject therefore narrate the idea of the self as an isolated entity. Mansfield note four types of subject: the subject of grammar, politico-legal subject, the philosophical subject, and the subject as a human person. While the vocabulary of self and the subject displaces the explicit present of experience, there is an underlying link between experience and these two notions. When Mansfield notes that subjectivity is primarily an experience, he is only echoing a common understanding of different subjectivities. There is an important consequence of seeing subjectivity itself as an experience. This follows from most contemporary accounts of the subject as something radically different from the Enlightenment subject. The latter guarantees an autonomous individual self, but a legion of writers from Freud to Foucault break away from this model and instead describe the subject as a constructed entity. If the subject is constructed, then there are no natural experiences that are possible. There are no innate experiences available to the human subject. All experiences, including sexuality, get constructed around themes such as power and culture. Foucault's attempt to place the self within discursive and power structure has been influential in social theory. We should remember that Foucault moved towards subjectivity and the self occurred through the engagement with the body. His attempt to make the body the site of power, at least in his work on the clinic and on discipline, was extremely influential. But it raises the question of what he actually means by a body. The sociological body, that which is the site where power relations are instantiated, is not the simple physical body. As Fox notes, the body for Foucault cannot be biological body, since this body is also discursively constructed. In particular, the most trenchant criticism against this notion of Foucauldian body is that it is passive and cannot be catalyst for resistance. Point out that Foucault's work on sexuality also meant a shift from the body to the self, in essence replacing a passive body with a reflexive self. which eventually leads to the idea of technology of the self. The point here is this: in contemporary theories, the notion of the self and subject have subsumed experience as the primary category. But there is enough that we can recover from these theories of self and subjectivity with respect to the problem of experience. As we will see in the latter chapter, the political and cultural framing of experience is similar to such framings of subjectivity. However, two issues that are central to this book remain out of the ambit of these contemporary theories. One is the explicit relation between experience and the act of theorizing, and the other is the relation between these view of self and subject with the formulation of self and experience in Indian philosophical and literary tradition. In the latter part of the book, we will explicitly engage with the ethics of act of theorizing itself, and over the course of the next few chapters, we will try and illustrate how the Western conceptualization of self and experience may not be enough to capture the complexity of social sciences in other cultures. In the chapter that follows, Guru has already set the stage for such a reconceptualization when he invoked the notion of space in the context of experience. He argued that the production of experience hinges on the reproduction of spaces, chapter 4, and goes on to add that without experience, the spaces cannot fulfill their epistemological promise. I would argue that the shift to the notion of spaces allows Guru to describe contemporary social experiences in terms of categories that are also sensitive to the Indian historical discourse. In particular, the notion of place is central to idea of religion and sacredness. This is most powerfully captured in the notion of sacred space that is common to both established religions as well as folk practices. One can look at the invocation of sacred and profane space in Babitai's biography as well as the temple entry movement described by Guru in the next chapter. Instead of purity and pollution, those problematic categories that were early on invoked by European scholars to describe Indian society, the notion of space offers a different set of conceptual categories to model Indian social experience. Thus, it should not surprise us that the idea of purity and pollution are themselves crucially dependent on prior formulation of space. Gurus argue that idea and concepts make sense only in the space which they belong to. In some sense, this is the Foucauldian move and might allow us to place the argument within a larger discursive space. Redefining experience through the idea of experiential space changes the traditional idea of self and subject with regard to the category of experience. Even where Ambedkar uses the term like self-respect, Gurus describe them in terms of experiential space. What is the consequence of shifting the discussion from self oblique subject to space? Let me point to one interesting philosophical consequence. In the context of self, the notion of I was important to make sense of the fact that we seems to have ownership of our experience. My experiences are mine, and all mine experiences are mine. The belief that there is a witness, a seer to our experiences also led to the postulation of the self. In both the Cartesian and latter theory of the self, the role of the self as a reflective agent, capable of judgment and action, gave a sense of autonomy to the self. However, shifting the locus from the self to space changes any naive belief in the existence of the self. Moreover, in the context of untouchability and Dalits, as described by Guru in the next chapter, there is indeed a constant abrogation of my experience as mine. The experiences of these communities illustrate the externality of experience externalized in the various kinds of spaces around them. Thus, their experiences are driven by the external, and they do not have the luxury of having private, subjective internal experiences. In other words, their sense of self is always mediated by a sense of self given to them by the spaces that they inhabit or that they are excluded from. One could thus say that their sense of self is actually supplementary to the sense of self that define other who inhabit the various spaces around them. Such a notion of supplementary self allow us to understand another important characteristics of untouchability, which is the subject matter of the last two chapters. Thank you, friends.